Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, January 6th around here, and we have a great show for you today. It is officially semifinal week. Wanted to get into a couple of storylines to start this thing off. We'll get into a couple of overarching ones, and then kind of zero in on both these games, give you a couple of storylines just to watch throughout this week, and then obviously when those games do kick off. Then we'll get into the CFP. We'll talk a little bit about that bye issue that a lot of people have been talking about the last couple of days. All four teams with a bye did lose in that second round, and definitely has added some questions to what the future for the CFP could hold. Then we got to talk about the SEC. A lot of people talking about the SEC is officially dead. They're not an elite conference. They're not the top conference in the country anymore. We'll break it down. Definitely the case, at least this year. Want to break it down and see what the future could hold there. Then we got a big time breakdown. We got to talk about the national championship happening tonight in the FCS. We have North Dakota State against Montana State. Want to give you guys a little bit of a breakdown there. Going to be an awesome game down there in Frisco, Texas, and two incredible quarterbacks in this one. And then we'll do a little bit of bowl cleanup in that segment as well. And then we'll do a little transfer portal update and then weekend news update, including a little bit of realignment that is starting to happen. Happens about this time every single year. It has officially started to happen this year. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all, we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. You can click that $sign, add any question, comment you like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that, and we can have fun back and forth. But let's go ahead and jump into this, and let's talk about some storylines. As we head into this week, we obviously have two incredible games on Thursday and Friday. Penn State, Notre Dame Thursday, Texas, Ohio State Friday. But there's a couple of great storylines as we head into this thing, and I kind of wanted to start it with some overarching ones. I got two here that are really huge storylines as we head into just this week overall, and definitely will be big-time talking points as we get through these games. And this is probably the biggest one of the bunch. There will be a new champion crowned in college football this year. One of these new head coaches will find their way to the mountaintop for the very first time. Obviously, Ryan Day has coached in a national championship. Steve Sarkisian was in the playoff last year. The other two are very, very new to this kind of a level, this stage of college football. So going to be really interesting to see who ends up doing it. And frankly, I talked about it earlier in the year, that this idea of who the number two coach in the country is, because I think all of us can pretty safely say it's Kirby Smart is number one at this point. Who is number two? I feel like it could be any one of these guys. I feel like whoever wins this one, you could make a very good argument. They're the second best coach in the country, especially those two guys on the left, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here, but definitely a thing that is going to be a huge talking point. It's going to be a really special thing to watch, and whoever comes out is going to be changed forever. They will no longer be just a head coach in college football. They will be able to put national champion next to their name for the rest of their life. And then you got the Blue Bloods. And Penn State, we can argue about one way or the other. I understand that's a little bit up for debate. But at the end of the day, four remarkably storied programs in this sport. Four programs that have really defined what this sport is in so many different ways. Ohio State, second most wins all time, 8 national titles. Obviously, that one in 2014 was the last one they had. The first 4 team could very well win the first 12-team playoff. And then for Texas, tied for fourth most wins all time, 4 titles. That one in 2005, the iconic 4th and 5 is the last time they were at the very pinnacle of the sport. Have been kind of trying to work their way back for quite some time. Lost in 2009 in the title. Obviously got a little bit close last year. They're trying to find their way back to the very pinnacle of this sport. Notre Dame is tied with them at the 4th most wins. So if Notre Dame gets that win on Thursday, there'll probably be Ohio State fans just take that little notch above Texas in that wins category. They have 11 national titles all time. They are absolutely dominant. Last one was in 1988, so they'd love to get back on that mountaintop. They'd love to be the team that defines the sport going into 2025. And then Penn State, 8th most wins all time, 2 national titles, one in 1986, the most recent. Really, really talented program, one that has been, I feel like, been on the cusp for a very, very long time, been right on that second level. This would be the moment to kind of break through that top level. And now let's move forward to that Orange Bowl, the Penn State Notre Dame game. And the biggest one to me is these are elite run games. They're going to go at each other pretty much the entire day. I really don't see this as a game where these teams get really creative or get crazy or anything like that. I think you play to your strength. I think you do what you do, and what they do is run the ball really, really effectively. They have an elite pair of running backs. Notre Dame with Jeremiah Love. We'll talk about his injury news later on in the week. Not sure how 100% he will be, but believe he will be playing in this game. And Jadarian Price next to him, absolutely elite as well. Penn State, Katron Allen, Nick Singleton. They absolutely dominated that Boise State game. Would love to do that again in this one, obviously. And then you do have Riley Leonard to the Notre Dame run game, obviously going to be a huge factor there. Drew Aller can scoot when he needs to. Definitely won't be as big of a factor as Riley Leonard will be. So it will be a war of attrition. It'll be whoever gets more push, whoever finds those gaps for those running backs is going to win the day, and both defensive lines on the other side are absolute nightmares to deal with. Then you got two coaches that I think are trying to elevate their status in college football, two programs that are trying to get back to where they feel like they belong. And both these coaches have relatively confusing reputations. James Franklin is one of the best coaches in the country, and then his record against Ohio State and Michigan and top 10 teams get brought up where he's an underdog. He does struggle in those big-time games, and this would absolutely qualify as one of those big-time games. And then Marcus Freeman, losses like NIU and Marshall have really hurt his resume quite a bit. Still a very talented coach, feels like he's starting to turn a corner. If they lose this game, some of those questions will continue to mount for Marcus Freeman, just kind of the nature of the sport. I think he's an absolute star in the making and will be a fantastic coach for Notre Dame for quite some time. That being said, you lose this game, narratives are everything, and definitely that will be one of the talking points. So it'll be awesome to see one of these coaches get to the mountaintop for the first time in their careers, but then these programs haven't been there since the 80s. Tons of potential in both these programs, tons of ability in these programs, not only this year, but moving forward to next year and so on. It could be a huge moment in Thursday night. If they get to the national title, if they're able to face off against Ohio State or Texas, regardless if you win that or not, you will be thought of as a coach that officially broke through, and you'll be looked at in 2025 in a little bit different of light than I think a lot of these guys, or these two guys, are looked at right now. And then this might be my favorite of the bunch. I'll be totally honest with you. Play calling battles in this game are going to be downright special. You have Andy Kotelnicki and Tom Allen on the Penn State side. You have Al Golden and Mike Denbrock on the Notre Dame side. You could argue that is the best coordinating group in the entire country on both those teams. Now, Ohio State and Texas will give you a good run for your money in both those categories, but this is going to be really, really fun to watch unfold. Andy Kotelnicki against Al Golden. Al Golden's been absolutely incredible getting his guys ready to play against really aggressive run teams, play really, really above their, I don't want to say above their weight, but play really fast, play really strong, kind of get after people. Andy Kotelnicki's that guy that can get a little bit creative, a little bit crazy, and do some things that might be able to put that Notre Dame defense in some tough spots, and then you kind of get back to that conventional run game. It'll be interesting to see how he attacks him and how creative he does get. You know, in that Boise State game, he might have gotten maybe a little bit too creative at different moments, but is a very, very talented play caller, and definitely Al Golden's going to have his hands full in this one. And then Mike Denbrock was incredible at LSU last year, as we all remember, and then if you're going to get up against a guy like Tom Allen that has just seen it all. He knows exactly what every offense is going to look like. He knows how to attack pretty much every offense. Now, this is going to be essentially a Herculean task. You have a three-headed monster at that running game for Notre Dame that are incredibly hard to get a beat on, and you have Jordan Faison starting to play really, really good football on the outside for Notre Dame, so it's going to be a hands-full type moment for Tom Allen and for Al Golden, really, and it's going to come down to which one of these play callers can really win the day. Is it the duo from Penn State? Is it the duo from Notre Dame? And I have to imagine you'll find the winner if you find the answer to that. Then we got to talk about this game, the Cotton Bowl between Texas and Ohio State. I think you got to start with the quarterbacks. These are both up and down guys throughout this year that are just playing really, really good football right now. Quinn Ewers and Will Howard have had complicated years. Obviously, Quinn Ewers has been talked about quite a bit in a number of different ways, and even coming out of that Arizona State game was talked about weirdly, which I thought was kind of crazy, but at the end of the day, Will Howard obviously had some tough moments. You know, had a couple of moments against Penn State that were not great, had the slide down against Oregon that obviously left a sour taste in some people's mouths, but at the end of the day, Quinn Ewers, 524 yards, 5 touchdowns, 1 rushing touchdown, and interception in the last 2 games. Will Howard, 630 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 1 INT in the 2 games thus far. Both of them are playing absolutely elite football. Both of them are probably facing the biggest challenge they faced all year on the other sideline. I think it's fair to say that both these defenses are the best they're going to face all year. They could be the very best in the entire country. So Will Howard's going to have to be a little bit more precise against this back end that will absolutely take the ball away whenever you give him the shot. And then Quinn Ewers going to have to handle pressure a little bit better with that ridiculous group they have on the edge at Ohio State. And then they're going to play a lot of 3 high safeties. So they're going to have to be very, very precise. And Quinn Ewers is going to have to lead this offense with a lot of confidence. And then you got to talk about the talent. The talent in this game is absolutely absurd. I think it'd be really hard to put together a game that has more outright talent in it across the board. Now, Oregon-Ohio State got very, very close. I would lean Texas just slightly over Oregon in this case. But on the offensive side of the ball, it's just ridiculous. You have Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, and Carnell Tate, and a million other guys on the Ohio State offense. And then Matthew Golden, Isaiah Bond, Trey Wisner, Jaden Blue, Gunnar Helm on the Texas side. Ridiculous talent just all across this field on the offensive side of the ball, but the defenses are really the show on both these teams. They're the ones that have literally, you cannot find a guy that is out of place. You cannot find a guy that is not uber talented. Frankly, you might have 11 guys on both defenses that are going to play on Sundays. And for Ohio State, it's Caleb Downs, Jack Sawyer, JTT, Denzel Burke, and so many more guys on that defense. And then Jahdae Barron, Anthony Hill Jr., Colin Simmons, Michael Taft on the Texas side. It's just ridiculous, the amount of talent that you're going to see on this field and the amount of guys that you're going to see on this field and then see on the NFL field here pretty soon. All these guys are remarkably talented and would not be surprised at all if out of this game we had 22 defenders, 22 of them went to the NFL after this. But going to be incredible to watch this one unfold, and sometimes it just comes down to who can make that one play. There's going to be plenty of guys that can make it on both sides. And then there's kind of an interesting one to talk about because Steve Sarkisian and Ryan Day, we talked about James Franklin and Marcus Freeman and how their reputations are a little bit complicated. Ryan Day's is plenty complicated as well. Steve Sarkisian's is a little bit murky at different moments throughout his career. But at the end of the day, Steve Sarkisian's the only coach that was in the Final Four this time last year and has made his team, gotten his team back here. Remarkable stuff from him, especially in that 12-team playoff. Ryan Day, been on the doorstep many times, hasn't quite broken through that door. But at the end of the day, I think it's fair to say the winner of this game, if they can go on and win the title, which obviously is up for debate, we'll talk about that later on. But at the end of the day, if they can do that, I think I would pretty confidently say they are the second best head coach in this sport, and I think you could pretty confidently say that they could be building something really special. Now, I'm not going to tell you that they're building an Alabama Nick Saban or a Kirby Smart Georgia, because I think it's going to be darn hard to do that. But at the end of the day, I do think these coaches, if they were able to win those games and move on and possibly win a national title, you're looking at these two right up there with Kirby Smart as the very best coaches in the entire country and could be on their way to a really special couple of years around Austin or around Columbus, depending on who gets the win here. So these are going to be awesome games. The amount of storylines in this thing is absolutely ridiculous. Obviously, Ohio State being an absolute juggernaut, and can Texas slow that down is going to be a huge thing we talk about, and we'll get into a little bit more stuff tomorrow, big-time players to watch, some rankings, different things that we'll break down tomorrow, but it's going to be really fun to watch. Can Ohio State win the first 12 team the same way they won the first 4 team? Can Texas officially get back to the mountaintop and be, quote-unquote, back in college football? Can Penn State and Notre Dame end what has been a very long drought of national titles and at least get back to that national title realm? But going to be awesome to watch this unfold. Let's take our first break here, and when we come back, let's talk about some of the CFP issues, and mainly we'll talk about those bye weeks. All 4 bye teams lost. Definitely something we're going to have to talk about going forward, and we'll get into that right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh,
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all the storylines as we head into this upcoming weekend. A new coach will be a champion for the very first time. It'll be really interesting to see how that coach is received. Obviously, Ryan Day might just need it the most, and we might talk about that a little bit later in the week. Probably tomorrow we'll get into a couple of questions around this thing, but let's get into the CFP issue that we have talked about a little bit on here and definitely has been talked about quite a lot not on here, and that's the bye weeks. Are the bye weeks a true disadvantage? Was it just this year? Is it something that is going to change going forward? There's a couple of different things to look out here, and there's a couple of different ways that we could possibly solve this issue. So obviously, as we all understand, all the bye teams lost. Oregon, Arizona State, Boise State, and Georgia all went down after getting their byes. Penn State went up 14-0 in the first quarter of the Fiesta Bowl. Texas opened up 17-3. Ohio State 34-0. It's kind of a little bit different. And then Notre Dame 13-3 in that first half. So it was pretty clear that all of these offenses struggled to get going, struggled to get their feet under them for different reasons depending on the game that you were looking at. But at the end of the day, does this really reward conference champions? Do these byes really give them the reward that they deserve, give them the leg up against some different teams that they absolutely do deserve for the remarkable seasons that they had? So that's the question that we have to kind of tackle here. And one of the big things that I think has kind of happened is people are assuming that this is going to happen every single year. I don't necessarily think that's the case, and there is a couple of reasons why this year feels to be a little bit different to me, at least in some respects. The biggest thing is two of these teams were double-digit underdogs. Now, Arizona State proved that they absolutely belong there. Boise State proved that they absolutely belong there. Now, Boise State didn't cover their spread, Arizona State did, but at the end of the day, when you look at these two teams, I don't think there were a lot of people picking Arizona State and Boise State. Now, both these teams made close games and it was very, very fun to watch these two teams play, but Arizona State entered as a 12.5 point underdog for a reason. Boise State, 11-point underdog for a reason, and when we come out of those games, I don't think anyone was sitting there saying, I cannot believe Penn State, I cannot believe Texas won. When we looked at the bracket initially, all of us said, if Texas wins that game against Clemson, if Penn State can handle SMU, they're a pretty good shot to get to that semifinal. So while both these teams really did prove, in a little way, me wrong in some respects, and definitely did prove a lot of people wrong and prove that they belong there, it wasn't all that surprising that Texas found a way to win that game. It wasn't all that surprising that in the second half, Penn State started to pull away from Boise State and make some really big plays down the stretch of that game. So while both these teams fought really, really hard and played incredible games and absolutely belonged there and frankly, maybe even belonged in that bye spot, but at the end of the day, it's not all that surprising that they didn't come out on the winning side of things. Both these Penn State and Texas were massively favored in those games. Obviously, it took Texas a little bit longer to get that thing going, but at the end of the day, not overly surprising that these two teams lost. Definitely would have been a little bit more upsetting if they got blown out, and that would have been something more to talk about. But at the end of the day, both these teams were not necessarily expected to win, and they didn't win. So some of it is just kind of circumstantial of that respect, where you do have a former SEC and Big Ten championship participant. They're playing a team that they're probably going to be favored against in the majority of respects and probably going to have a number of advantages against. Obviously, Arizona State did a great job of fighting back in that game, but I don't think anyone woke up the next day saying they were shocked that Texas and Penn State won those two games. And then you got the other two, and they were slight underdogs with some extenuating factors in those games. And this is obviously something that we talked about when we were breaking down the Georgia-Notre Dame game. Gunnar Stockton is not why they lost that game. If Carson Beck plays that game, I don't think they win that game. So it's not necessarily to put it all on the quarterback and say if Carson Beck had played, it would have gone entirely differently. Does change the way that Notre Dame attacked that game. I do think they played a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage. I think they flew downhill a little bit more often than they probably would have if they were playing Carson Beck. So I do think it played a factor at the very least. I don't think it was the all end all be all of this game. I don't think it was the reason that Georgia lost this game. But that being said, it definitely was an extenuating factor going in. Definitely kind of changed the way that it was perceived as we were going into that game. A big reason why a lot of people picked Notre Dame to win that game. And then Ohio State is Ohio State. I mean, we all saw what we saw on last week, and if Ohio State's playing at that level of football, they're the best team in the country. They are going to beat Texas by double digits this upcoming week. They're going to beat the national champion, whoever that is, in a couple of weeks after that by double digits, and they will be the national champion. Period. End of story. So when you look at this Oregon team, it's very easy to look back and say, how could they let this one slip away, or look back and say they got really hurt by this format, and I would absolutely argue that you're correct. They definitely did get hurt by this auto-buy system where Ohio State gets relegated down to the 8 spot instead of the 6 spot where they likely should have been playing Texas this past weekend. So a couple of different things that absolutely do have to be kind of tweaked here, but the reality is, I think when you look at these two games, or at least going into these two games, I picked Ohio State to win. I think a lot of other people did because we saw what Ohio State did against Tennessee. I don't think anyone thought it would be insane if they beat Oregon after that. And then regardless of the bye scenarios, one way or the other. And then for Georgia Notre Dame, without Carson Beck, it obviously changes the mental math of how this game is going to go down. A lot of people were picking Notre Dame for that reason. Now, that's not necessarily the reason that Georgia lost that game, but it is something to be said. You know, I think the bye is not an advantage by any means. I do think the bye hurts you regardless of its, all things equal. I would rather play the game the week before than not play the game the week before. I fully agree with that. But I do think there were some extenuating circumstances in this year in particular that kind of hurt some teams that had those byes that maybe wouldn't hurt those teams quite as aggressively going forward. So I think there's an argument to be made that we need to get rid of bye weeks and we need to change the way that we go about it. But I think there's also an argument to be made that this year was just a little bit different. You had two conference champions in the Big 12 and in the Mountain West that found their way into those bye spots, and they played teams that were just a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger than they were. Now, Penn State showed that a little bit more than Texas did against Arizona State, and the gap was a little bit bigger in that game than it was against Texas-Arizona State. But at the end of the day, it definitely did have an effect on those two games. I don't think anyone was surprised that Texas and Penn State won those games. And then in these, Ohio State is an absolute juggernaut right now, and Georgia without their quarterback did change a little bit of that game. Don't think it changed the result, but absolutely changed the way that Notre Dame attacked that game. So overall, there's reasons for these bye struggles, and I don't necessarily know if they're going to follow over into 2025. They definitely could, and it's definitely something that we're going to have to explore over the next year, but there were certain things that were kind of just this year and might not be following it into next year. So definitely something to think about there. It'll be interesting to see, what we can do, and that's kind of what I want to explore here. A couple of solutions to fix this bye problem, whether that's getting rid of byes, ending auto byes, a couple of different things right here. And the first one is expanding to 16 teams. This is going to happen. I can almost promise you that this is going to happen. There are so many different things that happen across the sport that they're all in the name of money. Let's just be totally honest with ourselves. But I would aggressively argue that 8 teams is probably closer to the correct answer than it is the other teams. But at the end of the day, I do think it's one of those things where you're probably going to have 16 teams. I do think you could have auto buys, possibly auto home games, which is something we'll probably talk about in a little bit more detail down the road, because the reality is you probably do want to reward them for something, give them a home game possibly to give them a little bit more incentive to win that conference champion rather than possibly lose it on purpose to get a little bit better of a draw. So there's a lot of different things going into this. I do think 16 is probably where we're gonna land at the end of all this, and definitely will be interesting to see how we get there, if buys stick around for a little bit longer before we get there and everything like that. But then you got to talk about ending auto buys. This is something I do expect to happen. Now, the problem with that is the ACC, the Big 12, and all of the Group of 5 conferences have to sign off on that. And that's something that kind of the reason that I bring up that possible home field advantage no matter what if you win your conference. That probably is the way they're going to have to go to get the ACC, to get the Big 12 to sign off on this, and to get, teams like Boise State to be on board to do this. Is you're going to have to give them a little something. You're going to have to give them a little incentive to do it. Maybe giving him that home game is enough. Now, the funny part about this is if we didn't have auto buys this year, if that was not a thing going into this tournament, you would have gotten Penn State, Notre Dame, you would have gotten Texas, Ohio State in the quarterfinals. You would have gotten this past weekend, so it would have been very interesting, and obviously those auto buys changed the math, and they changed the way that this thing fully worked out. We would have gotten those semifinal games one thing earlier, and it would have been interesting to see how all of that kind of unfolded, but it's definitely something that we're going to have to talk about. All those conferences have to sign off on it, and it might be tough to get them to come to that table, but something we're going to definitely talk about going forward, and definitely something that will be pushed for very, very hard behind closed doors. And then this is something that I think a lot of people have kicked around. Some people have kicked around no home games at all, which I don't know if that would be quite the advantage that people want it to be. I think 2 rounds of home games could be an interesting idea. So hypothetically, you have a situation where instead of Ohio State and Oregon going down to play in Pasadena, they're going up to Eugene, Oregon, and you get to be behind your home crowd. Now, I think Ohio State was probably winning that game regardless, if I'm being totally honest with you, but the other one to think about, Gunnar Stockton making his first start in his UGA career in front of his home crowd instead of in New Orleans is an entire difference. So that definitely could have flipped that game just a little bit. Obviously could have helped that defense a little bit more, and definitely could have put that Notre Dame offense in some interesting waters early on. And then ASU, if they were playing that game at home against Texas, that crowd gets very involved very quickly. It's not split down the middle, and maybe they can keep that momentum going. Maybe they can win that game at the end of the day and possibly complete that comeback, and would have been really interesting. Definitely a better incentive for some of these teams to win their conference, and then they get that home game. Would change the math when you talk about bowl games. You know, where do you want to slot these bowl games? How do you want to utilize them? Would the Orange Bowl be willing to, at times, be outside of the playoff? That's kind of debate that will go back and forth. I'd be a little bit surprised if they were willing to do it, but at the end of the day, I do think it could be a solution, could be a way to reward these teams for getting that bye and also keep that energy in those conference championships without, really tipping the scales one direction or the other. So I think there's a couple of different solutions out there. I think there's a couple of different ways to look at this. I don't love bye weeks. I do think the bye week, if everything else is equal, I would rather play the game than not play the game, if I'm being totally honest with you, but I do think there needs to be a nuanced conversation here, because I think some of the stuff that has happened this past week in accordance to these bye teams might not follow into 2025. It very well could, but I do think there needs to be some tweaking here and there with the bye weeks, and we just need to figure out a better way forward for that. Let me get to Anthony real quick here, but I just wanted to talk about this before we moved on. Yeah, give me 2 seconds here, Anthony. Apologies. I see what you're saying. I've seen that stuff as well. I've seen Miami been kicking around for a couple of different guys in the portal, and it's all pointless, if I'm being totally honest with you. There's a million things that will start to come out, especially around that guy over there at Texas. There will be a million things that will come out about him. I tend to believe he's going to the draft. I really have not heard anything from people that I very much trust around that program to make me think anything different. Miami obviously is going to have to go out and get a quarterback, and they absolutely will. So we'll see what happens there. Definitely going to be really interesting to watch that unfold, but it's obviously something, it's going to happen every single year. People are going to have things to say. People are going to have quote-unquote sources that tell them that Quinn Ewers is going to Notre Dame, and then the next day he's going to Miami, and then the next day he's going to Oregon. At the end of the day, we will hear from him at some point when his season ends. We will hear from him one way or the other. Right now, I would very much lean towards him going to the draft. Can't necessarily say that with absolute confidence. So we'll get into that in time. Obviously, definitely something that we will talk about, and that Quinn Ewers news is something that I think a lot of people are waiting for. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about the SEC. The big question going around is the SEC dead? Are they officially done as the top program or top conference in the country, and how long could it take for them to get back on top? We'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about that issue with the CFP. The bye weeks have been making people a little bit angry and definitely something that they're going to have to address as we get into this offseason and likely a couple of years down the road, but definitely something that they're going to look into, and we'll see if those bye teams can have a little bit better of a time this next time around. But let's talk about the SEC. Is the SEC dead? Anthony says no. I tend to agree with him, but let's get into a couple of reasons why the SEC has kind of found their way back to the pack just a little bit and what could possibly happen as we move forward to the future for the SEC, because I don't think many people believe that the SEC is just going to go away, that they're just going to fade into oblivion and not be a big conference in this sport anymore. Now, one big thing to talk about, the Big Ten does sit at 9-5 in the bowl season thus far, 2 teams in the Final Four, obviously, with Penn State and Ohio State. Meanwhile, the SEC is 8-6. One team in the Final Four, that's the newbie Texas, and a lot of people have been saying that's pretty much a Big 12 team. Understand where that's coming from, understand why people are making that argument. You had Illinois win over South Carolina, you had Michigan beat Bama, you had Ohio State beat Tennessee, and everyone started doing victory laps, and I fully understand why. There were SEC teams at the end of the year that were getting on my nerves, if I'm being totally honest with you. But it's going to be really interesting to watch what happens. I've been very clear about this. The right teams got in, that's no question, and they definitely proved me. South Carolina and Alabama did me a very good favor by proving me right on that one. But at the end of the day, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens the rest of the way. Is the SEC going to continue to fade and the Big Ten going to take over the sport for the next 20 years? Or is it going to be a little bit bouncing back and forth? But first, let's talk about the reasons for the SEC sliding down the scales just a little bit here. This is obviously one of them. There's no doubt about that. The NIL part of this is going to play a huge factor in why the SEC is not dominating over the sport anymore. I do think the one place that I kind of diverge from some people is the SEC was the only person doing it before NIL was introduced. I can almost promise you that was not the case. There were people in absolutely every single conference that had the ability to leverage money maybe they shouldn't have been leveraging to get certain guys on their roster. Whether you want to talk about the powerhouses like Ohio State, that has been very much at the top of the sport for a very long time. Whether you want to talk about Michigan, who has plenty of money in their back pocket. Texas has been doing this for years, I have to imagine. I don't want to make any aggressive allegations, but at the end of the day, I think we all understand that NIL was just introduced a couple of years ago, but the reality of it was happening quite a bit before. So I think the SEC probably led the charge in that. I think the SEC probably had the most teams that had the most revenue to play around with, and that's for a number of different reasons. Mainly because when you come down to the Southeast, I've lived here my entire life. College football is a little bit different. NFL is not the winner here. NBA is not the winner. Any other sport is not the winner here. It is college football. So more fans are more involved there. The media is more involved there because the fans are more involved. So there's a little bit back and forth. The SEC has been able to do this for so long because the SEC has been the best conference, because the SEC has the most interest, because the SEC makes the most money. So it's kind of gone back and forth. It's been kind of a rotating theme for a very long time. Then NIL was introduced into the game, and everyone had the ability to say to their fans, you give us X amount of money, that money's going straight towards, getting better players for this team, getting us to a national championship type level. More fans are going to be willing to do that. More fans are energized to do this. Where you talk about SMU raised a ton of money this past offseason. Indiana, the exact same. I believe $13 million was the number that they came up with. So the reality is, you had a time before the last 5 years, let's say, you had a time where some teams were actively, I don't want to say actively paying players, but were engaging in that activity is the way that I'll put it for the time being. And the majority of those were in the SEC. Not all of them were in the SEC. I can almost promise you, Ohio State, Penn State, Texas, USC, all of those teams were absolutely in this conversation as well. So while the SEC absolutely got the most out of the pre-NIL era, I think it could have been for different reasons than just the money factor of that. Definitely did help him out quite a bit. I won't lie about that, though. Then you got the transfer portal. When you talk about the guys that used to be in that Alabama or that Georgia room, I think you got to look at them and say, if you were looking at them, let's say, 10 years ago, I think is probably the best way to put this, is you would look at the backups or the third stringers for Georgia or Alabama, and you'd say, those guys are better than the starters for Mississippi State or for Notre Dame at different respects throughout the last little bit, and that's just no longer the case. That's no longer going to be the case. Players having the freedom and the ability to jump around and play around with the portal and see where they want to end up has kind of taken that away for Georgia. You get to that second level, and not quite as talented as it used to be. Still very talented kids and still littered with 5 and 4-star talent, but the reality is that gap between the first and second stringers is a little bit stronger, or a little bit bigger than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago for a Georgia or for Alabama. And the teams that are benefiting are a Notre Dame that's getting a couple of transfers like Riley Leonard to help them out on their way, or like an Indiana that got a ton of guys from JMU. Obviously, a little bit different situation there, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but a lot of different things have played into this. The transfer portal has just taken away the margin for error. There's no ability for Georgia to say, well, we can get a couple of guys injured, no big deal, we'll be able to trot out our second strings and still dominate these guys. You can't do that anymore because your second strings have found their way to other programs, and then you're essentially playing your third strings as your backups, and other teams are doing the exact same thing. So you found the middle ground in the kind of talent acquisition of this sport, where the portal has opened the door for an Indiana or for an SMU or for a Notre Dame even to get the guys that they need and to move forward in the sport and meet the SEC where they are. And then you got COVID. This is the one that I think is kind of being overlooked, if I had to be honest, because when you look around the rosters in college football right now, just littered with guys that are 23, 24, 25, and even a 29-year-old over on Miami. But the reality is, the guys have played tons of football. And when you find those guys, especially Indiana is probably the best example of the year, where they had a lot of guys that could have been playing in the NFL. They had a lot of guys that were old enough, at the very least, to be playing in the NFL, so they have a certain level of toughness. They have a certain level of discipline. They have a certain level of football knowledge that maybe that freshman over there at Georgia or that sophomore over there at Alabama just doesn't. So there's an ability for a team like Indiana to have a very experienced, very deep roster that knows how to play football more than anything else and knows how to play within that system more than anything else. And we saw that this year. They took advantage of the opening that they had, and they dominated the teams that they were supposed to dominate because they had that prerequisite ability to say, I know what this situation calls for because I've played a lot of football in my life. So COVID really opened a door for a lot of these teams. I don't know if it'll be slammed shut afterwards because of NIL, because of the transfer portal, but it absolutely did give them a little bit of ability to some of these teams just scale at the very right moment. Indiana probably the main among them, if I'm being totally honest, but that absolutely played a part, at least in this year, in the last couple of years, with the SEC just finding their way back to the pack just a little bit. But then you have to talk about what the future could hold, because the reality is there's a lot of different things that could possibly happen as we move forward in this sport, and a lot of different ways that the SEC will try to do this very thing. The SEC very well could bounce back up to the top. I think there's a very real possibility that in 2023, 2024, we look back and say the Big Ten had a really nice run there, and then the SEC took back over. And I think you could look across the board and see a number of different teams that could possibly make that happen. Texas could very well be the top team in the country going into 2025 with Arch Manning. I saw some people rank them there, so could very well be that number one team. Georgia could find more offensive talent. We'll talk about that here in a second. They definitely did this past weekend, but definitely could elevate right back to where they used to be. Maybe not that level, but definitely still to the upper echelon of the sport. Bama could very well find their stride with the right quarterback. Then you have Florida, South Carolina, Auburn, many other teams that might be a little bit on the outside looking in right now. The right things click at the right time, especially down there in Gainesville, Florida. I think it could be a special year in 2025. So that very well could happen. Now, you do look at the Big Ten in 2025, and you see Ohio State going to be really good, going to have the talent, definitely have a lot of guys leaving, but let's be honest, Ohio State's going to be plenty fine when it comes to talent. Penn State, if Drew Aller does come back, which there's been a little bit of talk back and forth there, they're going to be an elite team. There's no doubt about that. They're going to be an elite team with that quarterback. Oregon, if Dante Moore is the guy that they're making him out to be, they're going to be more than fine. They're going to be right up to the top of the sport. And then you do have Illinois. You do have Indiana. You have Michigan with Bryce Underwood coming in. So I would lean that the Big Ten is going to be the best conference in 2025. But as we saw this year, I thought that the SEC was the best conference in 2024. That didn't end up being the case. So I think it is a little bit of a back and forth, and could very well be the SEC bounces right back up to the top, and it's really not all that far-fetched. When you look at the Power 4 win-loss records against other Power 4 conferences, SEC still has the cake here. They're still 10-5 against other conferences, ACC 8-9, Big 10 6-7, Big 12 5-8. So the SEC is doing more than fine. They're not far from the top by any means. They're at the very worst, the second best conference in the country, and I think they are right now. But at the end of the day, they could very easily just jump back up to the top next year and stick there for quite some time. And then you could have this, and this is kind of where I think this is going to go. I think with NIL and the transfer portal and a million different developments happening in a million different ways in this sport, it's it's going to be harder and harder to dominate for a long period of time. It's the same reason that when Nick Saban left and we were talking about Kalen DeBoer taking over at that job, I said they're going to take a step back, and they were going to take a step back if Nick Saban was in that room or not. That's the reality of this sport now. It's going to be really hard for a team to go on a 15-year run like Bama did, or even to go on some of the runs that a Clemson team did or a Georgia team did, because the reality is you go on that national stage one time, every other coach in the country is looking at your guys, seeing who they can poach. That's just the reality of the sport right now. Don't necessarily love it, I won't lie to you, but at the end of the day, I think it's very, very normal to think that these teams are going to bounce back and forth. You know, one year it'll be Michigan, Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State up at the top. The next year it'll be Texas, Georgia, Alabama, and Ole Miss at the very top of the sport. So it's going to be a battle back and forth. I can almost promise you that there is not going to be a year, or especially, you know, that 15-year stretch it felt like where the SEC dominated the sport. I just don't see that happening in the near future, really in the future of the sport at all. And then you do have this idea. The bottom two conferences could continue to close that gap. I do think they did that just a little bit this year. I still think there's a pretty fair gap between the two. Now, we did see Arizona State push Texas to the absolute wire. We did see some other teams, you know, push people throughout this offseason, or postseason, excuse me. But at the end of the day, there are the two conferences up top. The SEC and the Big Ten are just a little bit different when it comes to talent, resources, and everything in between. The ACC and the Big 12 are just a little bit different. That is why you see the FSU and Clemson's of the world trying to get out of the ACC. That's why you see a lot of the movement that we've had. Obviously, this is what I would like to happen. This is my very best case scenario is we have four conferences that any given year could be the best conference in the country, and we treat them that way. I can't promise that's going to be the case. When you look at the SEC and the Big Ten, they continue to get that gap, and I think as we move forward into that revenue sharing era, I think it could be a little bit more aggressive than it was before. So there's a lot of different things to kind of go into here, and I think there's a lot of different ways that this could go forward. I think the SEC could very well bounce back and be the class of the sport for the next decade. I think it's very likely that the Big Ten takes over for a little bit of time, and then it goes back to the SEC, and then back to the Big Ten, and then so forth and so forth. So I do think it's one of those things that we're just going to have to wait and see. The SEC is not dead. I can almost promise you that. The SEC is not going anywhere, and Alabama, Georgia, Texas, they've all been in this situation where the sport has changed. It maybe doesn't benefit them quite as much as it did before. They found their way back up to the top. So I have a hard time believing that these teams, Georgia, Alabama, Texas, Tennessee, all of these teams in the SEC are just relegated to being the second-class citizens of college football. That being said, right now they absolutely are, and you're going to have to move forward and try to find a way back onto the top of the sport if you're Greg Sankey, if you're the SEC, but the Big Ten is locked and loaded, and they absolutely want to keep that top spot because it has come with a lot of benefits. For the SEC, it would come with the same benefits for the Big Ten, so it'll be interesting to watch all of that unfold. Definitely something that we'll get into, and Anthony had a couple of comments here, First of all, definitely agree with you on the idea the SEC isn't dead, but I think Alabama's in a weird spot, right? Everything's going to change, and a lot of people are going to look at him differently, and Kalen DeBoer was never going to be Nick Saban. No one who ever walked in that door was going to be Nick Saban, even if they found a way to get Kirby Smart. He was not going to be Nick Saban because I don't think that person can exist in this sport today. I think it's too variable. I think it's too different, and I think it's one of those things where any coach is going to have to fight tooth and nail to keep 3-4 years of really sustained success going, much less 15 years of really sustained success. And then you do have the SEC. Obviously is going to be something where they're going to try to add more people. Let's just be totally honest. The SEC has seen what it looks like to be the second best conference in the country. They're probably looking at the ACC right now, seeing if they can poach some people. So we'll talk about that obviously in time. Definitely something that is probably being kicked around Greg Sankey and all those guys right about now. And definitely something that they will explore. Same way I think the Big Ten will explore that idea with a team like North Carolina or Virginia or a couple of these other teams. So definitely something that we will talk about, hoping we can avoid that for the time being, but definitely something that pops up every offseason. Have to assume it's going to pop up this one as well. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, let's talk about the FCS Championship. We got to give some love to the FCS here. We got to give some love to the championship that's happening tonight. North Dakota State against Montana State, and then we'll do a little bit of wrap-up over the bowl season right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the SEC and what they're doing going forward. They are not the best team in the conference in the country, but absolutely could be right back there next year, could be right back there for quite some time next year. But we'll definitely talk about that more as the offseason go on. Anthony did have a question here, or did have a comment right here about the bowl games that we were talking about, and it's definitely true. You know, certain of those games are a little bit more SEC leaning in a lot of different ways. I will say, I was at that Peach Bowl a couple of days ago. I think ASU fans won that day. I think they probably won that margin, whether it was 55-45, I don't know. But at the end of the day, I do think ASU fans might have won it over Texas fans, so maybe there's not quite that big advantage. It's definitely something to discuss, though. Those Southern games definitely do give a little bit more credence to the SEC teams in them. We'll have to definitely kind of get into that, and maybe that's another reason to possibly lean into home games going forward in that second round. But we'll obviously talk about that going forward, but we got to talk about the FCS championship. We have a championship going on tonight, and we definitely got to give it the love that it deserves because it has the only undefeated team left in Division I football in it, Montana State. They've played incredible football this year, and it's got NDSU, and if you know anything about FCS football, it's probably North Dakota State, if I'm being totally honest. They have dominated this sport for so long. They have been one of the most dominating forces in college sports for the last decade and a half, really. They've been absolutely dominant and have been incredibly fun to watch. They've taken a little bit of step back the last couple of years, and Montana State has really filled that void. They've been absolutely dominating the sport, especially this year, have been absolutely incredible. Looking for a 16-0 finish, their first title since 1984. They did lose in 2021 to this very team, to North Dakota State. So a little bit of payback might be in order. North Dakota State looking for their first title since that 2021 game, and they're 10th in the last 14. They would absolutely dominate the sport. They would get 10 in 14 years. Just absurd in every sense of the word, regardless of what level you're playing on. That is absolutely insane. Incredible coaches have walked through there, and they've changed coaches throughout that time. They're right back where they have become accustomed to being, at the very top of the sport. Cam Miller is the quarterback you're going to want to watch for North Dakota State. He was the one that won. Honestly, North Dakota State might be better than what Alabama is. They might be Alabama times 2 at the FCS level, if I'm being totally honest. The way they've dominated the last 15 years is absolutely ridiculous. But if you were to draw a comparison, it absolutely would be those two. North Dakota State to Alabama, but North Dakota State dominates them even more than Alabama dominated the FBS level. But Cam Miller is the quarterback for NDSU. He was the one that won the title the last time around when they played Montana State in 2021. Really talented player. Has played a ton of good football, played some really good football in that championship game, and then you got touchdown Tommy Mellott on the other side, the Walter Payton Award winner, kind of the FCS Heisman, at least offensive Heisman, but really the Heisman. He's definitely a very talented player. Has had an incredible year, almost 1,000 yards rushing. The kid is absolutely ridiculous, and both these quarterbacks are really ridiculous. As good as these quarterbacks are, the running backs are downright special as well. You got Barika Kapenu, the running back for NDSU, along with Shamar Brown, both remarkable players, one over 1,000 yards, one just over 700. You have Scott Trey Humphrey, very talented, 1,300-yard rusher. Adam Jones for Montana State as well, 1,100-yard rusher, and he's a freshman. So there's a ton of talent in the backfields of both these teams. There's going to be a ton of run game in the backfield of both these teams. So the question becomes, can there be playmakers on the outside? Is there a way to get a little bit of pass game involved in this, and who would have the advantage there? It's pretty aggressively North Dakota State, and it's pretty aggressively because of one guy. Bryce Lance is an absolute monster on the outside for NDSU. 6 catches, 125 yards in the 3 scores, including the game-winning score in the semifinal game against South Dakota State. He's a special player. He's an NFL talent on the outside at wide receiver, and he's absolutely someone that can give them a little bit of advantage on the outside over Montana State. So that's definitely something to think about. You know, NDSU has a little bit more advantage throwing the ball around the field, at least in terms of talent on the outside. Montana State definitely has a little bit of advantage running the ball. They have a duo of 1,000-yard runners. Tommy Mellott's near 900 yards, so They definitely have the factor on the ground. North Dakota State might have a little bit more ability to push the ball down the field in the air. And then the question becomes, which defense is more equipped to slow it down? Because these are two elite offenses, top 3 in scoring offense in the country. They're top 10 in scoring defense, so they can definitely get after you a little bit. 37 sacks for both these teams, absolutely even on the year. You got to disrupt these quarterbacks. One way or the other, they have to get after these guys, make sure Tommy Mellott and Cam Miller can't create with their legs, and make sure you can't get the ball to Bryce Lance. If Bryce Lance can take over this game for North Dakota State, he's one of the best. Him and Tommy Mellott are probably the best players on the field. Bryce Lance, we'll get to that here in a second. Bryce Lance is absolutely someone that can take over this game. But you got to have playmakers out there. You got to have that guy that'll make that one play throughout the game. It could be Darius Gevens for NDSU, 2 INTs on the year, very talented guy on the back end, flies around. And then for Montana State, the guys on the back end, Andrew Powdrell and John Johnson, very talented players. Both guys that can make some big-time days. Powdrell has 7 pass breakups on the year. John Johnson has multiple picks this year. Very, very talented players on the back end for both these defenses. So this is what a national championship should be. These are the 2 best teams in the FCS level. It is good on good all over the place. There is not a place that you're going to find a massive margin one way or the other for these teams. They both do a really good job of taking care of the football. They both do a really good job of taking away the football. They both do a great job of running the football and passing the football. They do a great job of defending both those things. They're a top 25 in just about every category you can possibly find in the FCS. It's going to be awesome to watch these 2 teams face off. So if you were thinking about sitting this one out, if you were thinking about not watching this one, I encourage you to watch this one. I think when we talk about college football today, I think we all understand that so much of it is being pushed toward the FBS and the Power 4 and really the Power 2. When you talk about the SEC and the Big Ten, giving a little bit of love to these guys and these guys that are very, very talented is definitely a way to keep this sport alive. It's definitely a way to keep this sport the way that we like it, the way that we want it, which is giving respect to every inch of this sport. And this is obviously a huge, huge day for them. Would love to have a lot of people tuning into this one and kind of prove a little bit of a point that the FCS is still very, very much alive. But let's get some players to watch, and I'm just going to keep talking about Bryce Lance. He is downright special, guys. He is a difference maker in every sense of the word. He is Trey Lance's brother, if anyone was wondering throughout this time. He is Trey Lance's brother, the quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. Elite wide receiver in every sense of the word. Very long, can make all the catches in the world, is a very, very polished route runner for how big and strong he is, can definitely run the routes that you need him to run, is nearing 1,000 yards on this year. Could very well break that tonight. In fact, I'd probably bet on him breaking that tonight, if I'm being totally honest with you. Very talented guy and might just be the most outright talented player on the field. Tommy Mellott might be right behind him, although it's very, very close between these 2. Then you got Logan Kopp, the leading tackler for the NDSU defense. In the middle of that defense, monster, an absolute beast. 3 sacks on the year, 3 INTs on the year. Very talented, very rangy guy, and he's going to have his hands full. He's going to have to run down Tommy Mellott a lot in this game, and then he's going to have to fill gaps incredibly well for Scott Trey Humphrey and Adam Jones, 2 guys that can really make you pay if you do not fill that gap the right way. Then we got Taco Dowler, a guy that is on the outside from Montana State. We didn't talk too much about the wide receivers from Montana State. They do have playmakers. 94 yards and a touchdown against South Dakota. He's got to make plays. When you talk about a team that is going to run the ball so aggressively, when you talk about a defense that knows you're going to run the ball so aggressively, you sometimes just need that one pass play. And this could very well be the guy that's on the receiving end of it. Going to be a huge player, been great all year. Might just need his best game of his life in tonight's game. And then you got Bodie Grebe. He has 7.5 sacks on the year off the edge from Montana State. If you don't get after Cam Miller, he can absolutely make you pay. He can make all the throws that he's going to need to make, and he'll probably go to number 5, Bryce Lance, quite a bit on those throws. So you got to get after him. You got to rattle him a little bit, make sure that they don't feel comfortable throwing those deep passes, because that's the way this game could change on a dime. If they can get after him very early, if they can make sure Cam Miller is not comfortable, you probably avoid that big-time play that NDSU is more than capable of making. And then we got to talk about keys to the game. The run game battle in this one is going to be downright special. Montana State averages over 300 yards a game, 3rd in the FCS in rush yards, and then NDSU is down at 20 with 192. Not a slouch by any means. Now, both defenses are absolutely elite at stopping the run, where you have Montana State allowing only 115 per game, NDSU only 119 per game. So it's good on good. It's as good as you could possibly want. Now, Montana State probably has the advantage when you talk about rushing offense, but the rushing defenses are very, very even, and it's going to be an absolute battle, one way or the other, who can get pushed on that offensive line. Then, turnover margin is a big-time part of this, and ESU, top team in the FCS when it comes to turnover margin, plus 19 on the season. They are 5 better in that category than anyone else at the FCS level. The next best is plus 14. Then you do have Montana State down at plus 8. Could that be the difference? Could they possibly find a little bit of an opening there where NDSU gets that one pick over Tommy Mellott, and that changes this game? And then the quarterback duel is going to be special. You will find very, very few quarterback duels in college football that are quite as good as this one, where Tommy Mellott, absolutely elite in every sense of the word. He's made all the plays in the world, was the FCS Heisman, is just elite in every sense. And then Cam Miller, very experienced player, has won a national championship already, will not be fazed by this moment, and he can make plenty of plays. No doubt about that. Both of them have over 3,500 total yards, over 40 touchdowns on the year. Dual threat guys that can make every single play in the book, and will be so much fun to watch unfold in this game. I'm going to pick Montana State. I got to be totally honest with you. I liked a lot of the things I was seeing from North Dakota State as I was getting ready for this game. I'm going to pick the guy that won the FCS Heisman. I'm going to pick Tommy Mellott to get a little bit of revenge for that team. He played a couple of snaps in that first game back in 2021. I think he's going to get a little bit of revenge in this one. I think he gets the win. I think Montana State finishes their perfect season 16-0. I think they win the FCS championship. But moving forward from that, going to be an incredible game tonight. Definitely tune in for that one. But let's get into a little bit of a bowl wrap up here. A couple of games that happened this last week to kind of put an end to bowl season. And we'll talk about Texas State, North Texas to start this thing off. Texas State got the win. North Texas had the star. There's no doubt about that. Drew Mestemaker was a huge star in this game. Made his first start since 9th grade. It was a JVB team. He went to a huge football powerhouse in Texas called Vandegrift High School. Really, really good team. And definitely one where it's not crazy that he did not start on that team, but was remarkable in this game. Went for 448 total touchdowns, 3 scores in this one, including a rushing touchdown that made me think that they might be able to come back in this game. But for Texas State, Lincoln Park tore up this game. 21 carries, 143 yards, 2 scores. Ended up having to put away with a 73-yard touchdown run. Really good stuff from this Texas State team. Cannot wait to see what G.J. Kinney can do in 2025. I think there's a team that could very well be that Group of 5 CFP representative. Then you got Minnesota, Virginia Tech. This one was a little bit monotonous at different times. Definitely didn't give us the scoring and the craziness that we'd wanted, but with a lot of the different extenuating circumstances, especially on the Virginia Tech side, makes a little bit of sense here. But Minnesota got the win. PJ Fleck got the Mayo Bath in front of Flava Flav. Very, very weird, very cool at the end of the day. Darius Taylor tore up the day, 20 carries, 113 yards, and a score in this one. Minnesota is a team I'm going to be watching very closely throughout this offseason. Some changes are coming, no doubt about it, but Darius Taylor, some portal guys they're bringing in, including Malachi Coleman on the outside, could be a very fun team in 2025. And then VT, I'm a little bit worried about a lot of the things that have happened in the portal for them. We'll talk about them in a little bit more detail throughout the offseason, but at the end of the day, a little bit worried about what the Hokies could have in 2025. And then you got Buffalo. They finished this one off in good fashion and kind of how I expected this one to unfold. Without Caden Salter, that Liberty offense was going to struggle, especially with the way that Red Murdoch and all those guys on the defense for Buffalo were playing. Absolute beast on the interior is Red Murdoch, along with Sean Dolock, but you have 13 tackles, a pick 6 in this one. Really, really good job. And Pete Lembo did an incredible job at Buffalo this year. It was in year 1, fourth time in program history that they've gotten to 9 wins. Really, really good stuff. They will be a MAC contender next year. If they can keep CJ Obaniah on that team, it's going to be a special group. And then for Liberty, they're going to bring in Ethan Vasco from Coastal Carolina to be their quarterback. They'll be right back in the mix for the Conference USA. They're not going to be far down for long. I don't know if they'll be able to compete with Western Kentucky and some of those other teams, but definitely something that we'll unpack in time and will be really interesting to see what this Liberty team is like in 2025. But was a remarkable bowl season. I think we can all agree. It was one of the best that we've had in quite some time. Hoping we can keep that energy going into 2025, and we'll do a little bit of full reaction to the bowl season probably sometime next week to give it a little bit more love than just going over the games very quickly, but we'll do that in time. Let's take our last break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about the portal. We got to talk about all the other news going on around the sport because there's quite a bit of it, and we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about that FCS championship coming up tonight. Cannot wait for that matchup between Montana State and NDSU. Going to be an awesome one, and definitely one that is just good on good all over the place. But let's get into a little bit of a transfer portal update, a little bit of news catch up from this past weekend, because there was quite a bit of stuff that unfolded this past weekend. But let's jump into the portal first, and we'll jump into one of the weirder situations first, and that's Jaren Kawe Sagopolo-Tele. Very talented quarterback coming out of high school, 5-star guy, very, very talented kid. He enrolled at Oregon during Rose Bowl prep, didn't necessarily have the right feeling, said he didn't necessarily feel like a priority. Imagine that. They're preparing for the Rose Bowl. But at the end of the day, he is finding his way over to Cal. Very, very talented kid. Absolutely will be their starter day one. And it will be Brian Harsin calling plays for him. So it'll be really interesting to see what he can do for the rest of his career. Very talented kid. Obviously was a little bit of a blip on the radar to start it. I still think he is a very, very talented, very good kid and absolutely can have a ton of success at the college football level. Also think he possibly could have seen Dante Moore start throwing the football and say, I might want to find my way somewhere else. So it could be good news for Oregon at the end of the day, because it could mean that you have an absolute star in Dante Moore. I tend to believe they do, but this is definitely a guy that is going to be very talented, and we'll see what he can do in his freshman year at Cal. I have to assume he's going to be the starter there. Then you got Robbie Ashford. Wake Forest has their guy at quarterback, and he is going to follow Jake Dickert over there. Very, very talented guy. Absolutely can make a ton of different plays. Does need to take a step forward when you talk about passing the football. But I do really like this fit. I do think it fits into, he did a great job unlocking what John Mateer can do with his legs. Absolutely, the ability that Robbie Ashford has here. Can't necessarily say he's going to light the world on fire in 2025, but I think he could be a very serviceable starter for them and definitely make some big-time plays in 2025. Taven Jackson, the quarterback for Indiana that came in and spot started a couple of different games throughout the year, Washington the main among them, he's going to UCF for 2025. I think this is a really solid pickup, if I'm being honest. This is a guy that has bounced around a little bit throughout his career, but you get him down there with Gus Malzahn, or not with Gus Malzahn, excuse me, with Scott Frost. I don't know why that was eluding me right there, but very talented kid, absolutely fits that mold, and we'll see what he can do down there in Central Florida. Very talented guy, and definitely could hit another level in 2025. This is the main event. This is the guy that everyone's talking about the last little bit. Zachariah and Zion Branch. Mainly Zachariah is the big time one to talk about now. Zion is going to be a plenty good player, but UGA picks up these two guys, and Zachariah is exactly what Georgia needed. This is a huge, huge pickup for this team. This is a get the ball in his hands and let him go work type of guy. He is a guy that you do not have to worry about anything else other than make sure that he has the ball in his hands, and he's going to make some special things unfold. So he's going to return kicks for them. He's going to return punts. He's going to make all types of plays on the outside, and he very well might be their number one wide receiver in 2025. He very well might have to be their number one wide receiver in 2025. So Georgia desperately needed some help at wide receiver. They might have gotten the best guy in the portal thus far. Then you got Squirrel White. FSU gets a huge pickup here. Definitely a guy that they're very much going to need. He can very much stretch defenses, and the reality of the matter is he's got to be on the field. If he is on the field, he will make big plays for you. If he is not on the field or is hampered while he's on the field, he is going to struggle. That's kind of been the reality of Squirrel White's career throughout his time, and definitely was the reality at Tennessee. It's going to be something to watch. Definitely. It's definitely a player that I think has the potential to be a huge player for Florida State. I also think has the potential to be a guy that you just wish you went and maybe use your resources somewhere else. Very talented guy. I think he could explode at Florida State, but definitely one that you never know if he's going to be fully on the field or fully healthy at any given moment. Tommy Brockermeyer is a huge pickup for Miami on the interior of that offensive line. This is a guy that, along with Francis Mauigoa, can really give you a really solid group, especially in the run game, can definitely give you a good amount of push, and I think he's going to be a really good player for them. I have to assume he's going to start at center. He's a very, very talented kid, and definitely will be a guy that Miami very much needs to get a little bit of that run game going. I think he could be a huge piece to that. Moving over to the defensive side of the ball for Miami, Ethan O'Connor, a huge one for Miami, one that they very, very badly needed, kind of in the worst possible way. But this is a true island corner. This is a guy that you can put on the field side, say, you take care of that, and he will take care of that 9 times out of 10. Very, very talented kid, and I feel like he's only scratching the surface of what he's capable of doing. A huge get for Miami, and definitely a guy that could very well be a star in 2025, possibly on that CFP team for Miami in 2025, who knows. But Trey Williams, another guy to talk about on the defensive side of the ball, that D lineman finding his way up to Ann Arbor, Michigan. A big-time pickup for Michigan here. Definitely a guy that they very much need. Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham walking out the door. This guy's going to have to slide into a starting spot, and he is a very good player, played some really good football against Texas in that CFP game. I think he's going to be an outright star in 2025. I really, really like this kid, and I think he could very well be a first-round pick in the NFL draft in 2026, if I'm honest. Marvin Jones, very talented edge rusher. He's going over to Norman, Oklahoma. Big-time pickup for Oklahoma here. Very athletic dude. Hasn't quite gotten to the production level that you would love to see from someone like that at Georgia or Florida State thus far, but very talented guy. Absolutely will be a big-time pass rusher for this Oklahoma team in 2025. Texas tried to make a small push here. Not sure they quite needed them quite as much as Oklahoma did, so definitely a big-time pickup for the Sooners, and one that, if they can unlock him, can be a huge player for them in 2025. Speaking of Texas, Travis Shaw has picked Texas as his new place. 6'6", 340-pound linebacker, or not linebacker, defensive tackle. Very, very incredible player. Really good at the point of attack. Very long arms, can separate very well. He's really incredible. I think he's going to be an absolute star in 2025. We've seen a number of guys come to that D-tackle room at Texas and end up in the NFL. I don't think this is going to be any different. I think he's going to follow the same path that Byron Murphy, that Tavondre Sweat, that Alfred Collins, and Vernon Broughton did this year. He's going to be a monster, and I think he's going to be a huge player for Texas in 2025. Moving forward to some guys that have jumped in over the last couple of days, and we'll start over there in Athens, Georgia. This one didn't make sense to me, and then it very much made sense to me when Zachariah Branch officially committed, but very talented kid. Absolutely a guy, very twitchy, can return kicks if you absolutely need him to, can handle out of that slot or on the outside, get some deep passes over the down the field, and I think there's a lot of different systems he could fit into. I think you could put him at Alabama. He would have a ton of success. I think over at Oregon would be incredible. I think Texas is one to watch here. I think that Texas really thrives with those get the ball in their hands and let them go type of guys. This is definitely one of those guys. So I think the market will be huge for this guy. I think Miami will be in for him. I think a lot of different teams will definitely push for him, but he is from the state of Texas. I think Texas might have a little bit of an inside track here, not knowing anything necessarily, totally me speculating, but the way that I look at it, I think he fits the mold of a Texas receiver. He's from that state. I think they're going to be pushing for him very, very hard. Jaden Rashada also came out of the UGA game and decided to go into the portal. Been a really odd career for him thus far. Started, committed to Oregon, decommitted, got to Arizona State, had that Florida craziness where he ended up suing Billy Napier, found his way to Georgia. A million different things have happened for this kid. So it's one of those things where hope he can find the right place, probably at the group of 5 level, if I had to imagine. Probably take a little bit of a step down, but very talented kid, can throw the ball all over the yard. So absolutely can make a lot of plays, and we'll see what the market is here. It'll be interesting to see how many teams are really interested in this kid, and does confirm, at least to me, that Puglisi is an absolute monster and cannot wait to see what he can do. Also confirms to me that they might feel a little bit more comfortable with Gunnar Stockton. Now, I do think they are going to get a quarterback in the portal one way or the other. The question is it a backup for Gunnar Stockton, or is it the guy that's going to come in and start? That's something we'll be watching over the next little bit, but especially with Carson Beck and Jaden Rashada walking out the door, I think Georgia would like to have at least a filler at quarterback, maybe even a starter, depending on how they feel about Gunnar Stockton. Noah Thomas is a guy you're going to want to watch for. Athens, Georgia is where he was pretty recently, and definitely feels like the on-odds leader here. If they can pick up him and Zachariah Branch, wide receiver problems are fixed over there at Georgia. It'd be a ridiculous group to be able to pick up. I know Texas is definitely wanting a receiver here pretty soon, so I wouldn't be surprised if they made a big move here, but those are the two teams to watch. Miami still a little bit on the outside looking in, but definitely could be one that pushes late and tries to pick up one here. I would lean Georgia right now, but I think those other two will definitely have something to be said in this one. And then Elijah Pritchett. He has found his way into the portal. The starter at offensive tackle for Alabama this year. Very good, a very good player. Absolutely a guy that can be very rangy, can start really wherever you want him to start, if I'm being totally honest, at pretty much any of these teams. Now, I do think a lot of SEC teams will be in on this one. I think LSU, Ole Miss, Tennessee all need a little bit of help at that tackle position. Would not be crazy if they gave him a call. I think Ohio State is absolutely one to watch here. He's been, they've definitely gotten a couple of offensive linemen. This will probably be the most talented guy they've been able to pick up. I think he could be huge and definitely be an immediate starter for them. So maybe Ohio State finds their way back to Tuscaloosa to steal another offensive lineman this offseason. And then we got news coming out of a couple of different places, and we'll start with the news that I don't think anyone wants to hear. MACtion is changing pretty much forever. NIU is joining, it's set to join at least, the Mountain West. We'll hear more news about this in the next couple of days, but DeKalb, Illinois is going to be a new place for the Mountain West Conference to set up shop in. It's going to be really, really weird. Obviously, NIU brought a lot of good attention to them this year, and this is obviously the payoff for that. That game against Notre Dame probably played a pretty good factor in this one. And then you look forward the next year and the next couple of years in this thing. Hawaii's going to have to travel about 7,000 miles to play a conference game on maybe a Thursday or Friday night. It's going to be ridiculous, but what can you do at this point? I think everyone understands that they're going to do what they want regardless of how much we yell that we don't want this to happen. But MACtion is officially changed. It's officially not whole. It'll be interesting to see who they go after to possibly fill that hole. A lot of teams out there, I don't think any of them quite fit the MACtion mold that I'd love them to fit, but at the end of the day, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Definitely a solid pickup for the Mountain West, and MACtion, we'll see if they have to pick up someone else. We'll see if they have to go out and get someone, or they're comfortable with the group that they have right now. Definitely going to be an interesting thing to follow, and realignment has officially started for 2025. Curtis Rourke, just a little bit of tidbit here. Sounds like he was playing on a torn ACL that he suffered in August the entirety of the year, which makes a truly ridiculous season just outright insane. He had 29 touchdowns, 5 INTs, 3,000 passing yards, 11 wins for the losingest program in college football history. This kid is special in every sense of the word, and especially from a mentality perspective. He is downright special. Would love to see him be a little bit more healthy for combine work. We'll see if that happens. Not sure if that's going to unfold, but definitely a guy that I think a lot of NFL GMs will really fall in love with, and I think this probably helped his case just a little bit more. And then to finish it off here, just wanted to send a couple of condolences to Kirby Smart and his family. Sonny Smart, his father, has passed away. He had a fall on New Year's Day in New Orleans, went to the hospital, has subsequently passed away. Very, very nice man, it seemed, from everything that I've heard throughout the last couple of days. Fantastic high school head coach in the state of Georgia. Coach Kirby Smart's teams, Coach Kirby Smart's team down in Bainbridge, Georgia for 6 years back in the 80s and 90s. And then he actually coached Gunnar Stockton's teams up there in Rabun County, Georgia. So a little bit of an interesting kind of crossover there. Definitely something that I'm sure they talked about quite a bit, and obviously was a very, very special man for a number of different reasons. Was always around Kirby in all those big games, and obviously played a big-time part in the guy that we have in front of us, that is Kirby Smart. So, remarkable guy. Wanted to send condolences out to the Kirby Smart family and everyone in the Smart family and everyone that knew Sonny Smart, because seemed like a really, really special person. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We have great people covering every single sport you could want. So anything in the world of sports you need, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening. I will see you tomorrow for some rankings, some questions, a million things around the semifinals coming up this week. So we'll break it down next time. I'll see you then.